The sea stretched out in every direction like a sheet of dark steel, glimmering faintly under the setting sun. The waves rolled in with a slow rhythm that seemed to echo the heavy silence on the deck. The warship loomed like a floating fortress, every surface smelling of oil and salt, the metal warm from the heat of the day, but cooling fast as the evening breeze swept in. The air was thick with that sharp scent of the ocean, mixed with the faint traces of gun oil and the sweat of men and women who had been standing at attention for what felt like an eternity. The crew stood in two neat lines, boots planted firmly, hands clasped behind their backs, eyes fixed forward, yet they could not help the small flickers of curiosity that darted toward the figure standing alone in the open space between them. She stood with her shoulders square and her chin slightly raised. Her uniform was not the crisp, pressed fabric of ceremony, but the worn and faded fatigues of someone who had been in the field for too long. The sleeves were frayed, the knees scuffed. Her boots bore streaks of dried mud and salt, as if she had walked straight from a battlefield to this ship. Her hair was tied back, but loose strands had escaped, whipping gently in the wind. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen too much, the kind of eyes that made others either step closer out of respect or keep their distance out of fear. At the far end of the deck, beneath the massive flag that snapped and cracked in the wind, stood the Admiral, his uniform immaculate, every line of his posture carved with the precision of decades at sea. His chest bore rows of ribbons and medals, yet his expression was unreadable, carved in stone. His hands were clasped loosely behind his back, but there was nothing casual about the way he stood. His presence alone could have silenced the deck even without the command that had brought them all here. The orders had been sudden, the crew summoned. To formation without explanation, the young woman pulled from whatever duties she had been performing and brought before the highest-ranking officer aboard. No one knew why, not officially at least, but the whispers had already begun long before. She stepped onto the deck. They said she had done something impossible. Some said reckless, some said heroic, a mission gone wrong. A line crossed, an order defied, but always ending the same. She had saved lives when by the book it should have been. Impossible, the kind of act that was talked about in low voices in mess halls and barracks, never in reports, never in meetings, never in the presence of brass. Now here she was standing on the deck of a ship anchored in calm waters, the horizon painted in streaks of gold and crimson as the sun dipped lower. The light caught on the edges of her profile, outlining her like a figure cut from iron and shadow. The crew kept their faces forward, but their eyes betrayed them every so often, flicking toward her, then to the Admiral and back again, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. The Admiral did not speak. He did not move. His gaze remained fixed on her as though he was studying every detail of her stance, every shift of her weight, every breath she took. The wind carried the creak of the ship and the distant call of gulls, but on deck there was nothing. No cough, no shuffle, no whisper. The air between them seemed stretched thin, ready to snap at the slightest touch. She did not flinch under his stare. Her feet were planted as if rooted to the steel. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, but there was tension in her fingers, in the way they curled slightly and relaxed again. Her chest rose and fell, slowly measured, as though she was preparing herself for something not entirely known. The crew could feel it too, that sense that something hung on the edge between them, something sharp and dangerous, not yet revealed, but inevitable. The light shifted again as the sun sank. Lower, the shadows grew longer, crawling across the deck until they touched the toes of her boots. The temperature dropped slightly, the wind catching strands of her hair and pulling them across her cheek. She did not brush them away. The Admiral's shadow loomed across the deck toward her, the flag above them cracking harder in the breeze, as if urging something to happen. One of the younger sailors in the formation swallowed hard, his throat tight from the tension he had heard rumors about. Her about what she had done, about the kind of missions that were never recorded and the kind of scars that never healed on their own. His gaze flicked toward her again, and in that split second he noticed something in her stance, a coiled readiness, a quiet defiance, as if she had not been called here to be judged but to confront the one doing the judging. The moment stretched on until it felt like time itself had slowed. The sky deepened to a darker shade of red, the sun hovering just above the waterline. The deck bathed in light that seemed to burn hotter than it should. Her boots planted firmly, her gaze locked on his, unyielding and unafraid. The crew did not dare to blink. Whatever was about to happen, they knew they would remember it for the rest of their lives. The air on the deck seemed to thicken as the minutes crawled forward, and still the Admiral said nothing. His eyes locked on the young woman with a look that was neither openly hostile nor remotely warm. It was the gaze of a man who had seen every kind of soldier, from the coward who broke under fire to the rare kind who stood unflinching in the face of storms, and he was trying to decide which one stood before him. Now the crew could feel the weight of the silence pressing into their chests. The creak of the ship under the shifting tide sounded louder than it should, the metallic hum of the deck plates beneath their boots, carrying up through their legs as if the whole vessel was holding its breath along with them. The young woman knew. This was not going to be a normal summons. To stand before the Admiral was to stand before the embodiment of the fleet itself, a man whose word could end a career or elevate one to legend. But she had walked through worse than this. She had been under fire in alleyways slick with rain and blood. She had crawled through the wreckage of burning vehicles, dragging men who had lost the ability to scream. She had fought with hands bare and lungs on fire. And now she stood here in the glow of the dying sun, facing down the most powerful man in the chain of command, as if he were just another obstacle. Whispers had followed her from the moment she stepped back onto base, whispers that started in the barracks and found their way to the mess hall and down the long, echoing corridors of the command building. They told stories of a mission gone so far off course that it should have ended in a body count. They said she had been ordered to withdraw, and instead she had gone deeper into hostile ground, that she had disappeared for hours before returning, half carrying, half dragging 3 wounded operatives across the border under fire. No one could agree on the details, but every version ended the same, with her surviving when she should have been dead, and with a truth that never made it into the official reports. The Admiral had been there too, not in the field, but in the shadows where orders were given and plans laid out on maps. He had known the mission parameters, he had known the risk, and when she had gone silent, he had already assumed her lost. Yet here she was standing before him, scarred but alive, her presence a living contradiction to whatever version of events the official record had been crafted to tell the crew. Did not know the politics behind it. They did not need to. They could feel it in the air like static before lightning. The unspoken truth that something about this meeting was not protocol. She shifted her weight slightly, the first movement she had made since taking her place on the deck. It was subtle, but it sent a ripple through the onlookers, a sense that she was preparing to speak or move or reveal something they could not yet guess. The Admiral's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but still he gave no order. Still he did not speak. The waiting was becoming unbearable even for the most disciplined among them. Every sailor there understood the delicate balance of power on display. This was not simply a soldier meeting with a superior. This was a collision of 2 forces, one bound by the authority of rank, the other by the authority of having bled and survived where others had not. The longer the silence stretched, the more the crew began to suspect that what was happening here was something they should not even be witnessing, something that might never be spoken of again once the moment passed. The sun had nearly reached the horizon, now the water reflecting bands of orange and crimson that shimmered with each small swell. The shadows on deck grew longer, sharper, the wind stronger. It whipped the flag above them into a frenzy of movement. the sound of it snapping against the mast breaking the oppressive quiet for only an instant before the silence seemed to close. In again, her gaze never wavered from the Admiral. Not once the crew could almost feel the locked exchange between them, like two blades pressing together, neither willing to retreat. A gull cried somewhere overhead, its voice carried by the wind as it wheeled above the ship before diving out of sight. The sound was fleeting, but it seemed to pull at the edge of the moment, as if reminding everyone on deck that time was still moving forward and that whatever was about to happen could not be delayed forever. The Admiral's expression did not soften, but there was something in his eyes now, something calculating as if he had come to a decision, though what that decision was, no one could yet tell. The young woman straightened slightly. Shoulders. Pulling back, the wind tugged at her fatigues, her hair shifting across her face, but she did not move to fix it. Every second she held that unblinking eye contact with the Admiral felt like another step toward some invisible line that once crossed, could not be undone. The crew could not help but imagine what she might do next and whether the next few minutes would end in a salute, a shout, or something far more dangerous. The air around them felt charged as though the whole ship sat in the path of an approaching storm. No weather radar could track the men and women standing in formation, could feel it in their bones and the prickling at the back of their necks. This was the kind of moment that would never make it into training, manuals, or official histories. Yet it would be told in quiet voices long after the ship had moved on from these waters. The Admiral finally shifted his stance, his boots scraping against the deck, the sound sharp in the still air, and for a brief heartbeat. It seemed as though the silence would end, but he stopped himself. Lips pressed into a thin line, gaze still locked onto hers, and in that restraint, the tension only deepened like the dark water beneath the keel of the ship. The stillness on the deck had stretched to the point where it felt unnatural, as though the very air had grown heavy and was pressing down on the shoulders of every sailor standing in formation. The waves against the hull had become a slow, steady rhythm. Like the beat of a war drum sounding somewhere far below the surface, the Admiral had not moved from his position. His gaze locked on the young woman as if this silent exchange between them was a battle of its own. One where the first to break would lose something they could never regain. The crew did not dare to speak or shift. They stood frozen in that taut, invisible line of tension waiting for the next move. The young woman breathed in deeply, her chest rising in a slow, deliberate motion, her hands loose at her sides for a moment. It seemed as though she might remain silent forever. But then her right hand twitched just slightly enough to draw the attention of even the most disciplined pair of eyes on the deck. Her fingers brushed against the hem of her shirt, the worn fabric rough beneath her touch, her gaze never leaving the Admiral's. She seemed to be measuring him, weighing whether he deserved to see what she was about to reveal. A gust of wind surged across the deck, snapping the flag overhead into a sharp crack. The sound echoed off the steel like the report of a distant rifle. The crew felt their own breaths catch in their throats, and though no one spoke, they all felt it. The shift in the air, the sensation that something irreversible was about to happen. She hooked her fingers into the bottom edge of her shirt and began to lift the fabric slow enough that every eye had time to register the motion. The rising sun of the day had long given way to the orange-red glow of the horizon, and the fading light caught on the pale skin just above her waistband, then higher, revealing the dark, uneven ridge of scar tissue carved into her side. It was not a clean wound. It was a jagged, brutal thing, the kind that spoke not of a surgical injury or training accident, but of raw survival torn into flesh by steel or shrapnel or fire. It traced a cruel line from just below her ribs to her hip. The edges puckered and discolored the mark of a wound that had tried to kill her but had failed. Gasps slipped from a few in the ranks, breaking the silence in small, startled bursts. No one on this deck could look at that scar and not understand it was the mark of a fight that no human body should have been. able to endure the skin around it bore faint discolorations. The faded ghosts of burns and bruises long since healed, but still present as a permanent reminder of what had happened there. The woman's face was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that made it clear she knew exactly what kind of weight this sight carried. The Admiral's eyes did not move from the scar, yet there was no widening of shock, no narrowing of disapproval. He stared at it as if memorizing its every uneven curve. The wind pulled at his coat, the light shifting across his face until the deep lines in his features seemed carved from stone, and still he said nothing. The crew could feel the pounding of their own hearts, the way the moment seemed suspended, on the edge of some silent verdict that only he could deliver. She let the shirt hang where it was not pulling it down, not yet leaving the wound exposed, as though daring him to acknowledge it. The crew knew the rumors, but none of them had ever expected. To see the truth with their own eyes, this was no rumor. This was not some tale of heroism embellished in retelling. This was real, carved into her flesh for anyone willing to look, and in that raw honesty, there was a kind of power that rank alone could never give. Her breathing remained steady, the sound of it barely audible above the hum of the ship's engines. Far below her shoulders were back her stance, as solid as if she were standing in the middle of a battlefield she had chosen to. Show this now in front of the crew, in front of the man whose decisions had likely put her in the path of whatever had caused it, and she seemed to be holding the silence, just to see if he would be the one to break first. The wind cut across the deck again, colder now, carrying the scent of salt and the faint tang of oil from the machinery within the bowels of the ship. One of the older sailors in the line closed his eyes for a moment, the scar pulling at something in him, a memory of his own, of battles fought far away in places no one ever admitted they had been, the kind of memories that never left a man, no matter how many years passed. Still the Admiral stood silent, still. She kept her shirt lifted high enough to expose the jagged line, as though presenting a piece of evidence in a trial without words. The crew could almost feel the unspoken conversation happening between them. In that silence, the weight of the mission, the betrayal, the survival, and the price all pressed into. That single moment, the scar was the proof and the question all at once. Her eyes locked on his, and for the briefest instant, something flickered there. Something like defiance, but tempered with the weariness of someone who had carried this truth. Alone for far too long, the ship shifted slightly under the swell, the deck tilting just enough to remind them all that the world outside this moment was still moving. The sea still restless, the night still coming, but here, in this space between them, time felt as though it had stopped waiting for whatever came next. The scar lay across her side like a line drawn by the hand of war itself, an ugly mark that told a story in a language only those who had been to the edge understood, and though she said nothing, every sailor on deck could feel the weight of it. Pressing into their chests, the sun had dropped lower now, and the light was softer, but it caught on the ridges of scar tissue, turning them into small shadows that made the wound look even deeper, even more brutal. The wind swept across the deck, and the fabric of her shirt rustled faintly, but she did not lower it. She stood rooted to the steel as though daring the Admiral to turn away. In the minds of the crew, the pieces began to fit together. They had heard scraps of her story passed from one mouth to another in mess halls and bunk rooms, and during long watches at sea, a mission in hostile territory gone sideways, an order to pull back, that she had ignored gunfire in the dark, an extraction window closing like a door on the last chance. To live, no one knew exactly where it had happened or how she had made it out. But everyone knew that when she came back, she had been half dead. Her uniform soaked in blood that was not all her own, and her eyes carrying the distant glassy look of someone who had fought through something no one should survive. Her breath was steady now, but she remembered every second of that night, the heat of the flames curling around her, the air so thick with smoke and dust it burned her lungs, the crack of rifles in the dark, the cries of the wounded over the roar of chaos. She remembered the impact when something sharp and heavy had driven into her side, a hot flash of pain so deep it made her legs buckle. She had pressed a hand to the wound and felt the blood spilling fast. But there had been no time to stop, no time to think the men behind her had been too badly injured to move on their own, and the enemy had been closing in. She had dragged them through corridors lit only by firelight, every step sending a new wave of agony up her side. She had pushed them ahead of her when they could walk and carried them when they could not. The ground had been slick underfoot, the sounds of pursuit growing louder with every turn, but she had refused to stop. She had known that stopping meant dying, and she had decided that if she was going to die, it would be after they were safe. By the time she reached the extraction point, her vision had been tunneling the edges of her sight, going dark. Her ears ringing from the blood loss, she had stumbled onto the waiting transport and collapsed only to wake in the base infirmary with the kind of wound that doctors said should have ended her before she ever made it off the field. But she had not died. And that was the part the official report could not explain without acknowledging how far she had gone outside her orders. The Admiral knew this too. She could see it in the way his gaze lingered not just on the scar, but on her eyes, as if trying to reconcile the soldier before him with the one in the classified files, the files that said nothing about the people she had saved, the ones who now stood alive because she had bled for them, the ones whose voices were never called to testify when her actions were reviewed. The crew shifted slightly, not out of restlessness, but because they could feel something dangerous in the air. This was not a ceremony. This was not recognition. This was something closer to a reckoning. The Admiral's silence had stretched long enough that it no longer felt like hesitation, but something deliberate, as though he was giving her space to lay bare the truth without a single word spoken. She let her shirt fall just slightly enough to cover part of the wound, but not all of it. The message was clear. She was not hiding it, and she was not ashamed. She wanted them all to see, because this was not just a scar, it was a ledger, a record carved into flesh of the cost that some were willing to pay when orders and morality collided. Her hands relaxed at her sides, but her eyes never left the Admiral's. The flag overhead cracked again. The sound sharp and hollow against the open sky. The ship swayed gently under the movement of the sea. The shadows of the masts stretching long across the deck as the last sliver of sun began to dip beneath the horizon. The day was almost gone, and whatever this moment was, it would end in the dark. The Admiral's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time his gaze shifted from her side to her face. Whatever he saw there seemed to hold him locked in place. She did not smile, she did not glare. She simply looked back at him as if to say, "This is what your orders cost. This is the truth you will not write down." And in that silent exchange, the deck seemed to grow even quieter, as if the whole ship was leaning in to catch whatever might happen next. The deck felt heavier now, as if the steel itself had absorbed the weight of what had just been shown. The scar lingered in the minds of the crew, even as her shirt now covered most of it. They could still see it burned into memory, every jagged line of it. A reminder that survival was not always clean, and that sometimes it came with a price so steep, no metal could repay it. The sun had nearly vanished, the light fading into a muted haze over the horizon, leaving the deck bathed in the deepening shades of twilight. The air was cooler now, the wind sharper, carrying the scent of the sea and something else that no one could name. The Admiral did not speak, but his eyes had changed. They were still hard, still sharp, but there was something else. Beneath them, something the crew could not quite read. It was not pity. It was not pride. It was something older, heavier. Perhaps the memory of his own battles and the scars he carried in places no one could see. He looked at her not as an officer, to a subordinate, but as one soldier to another. Across the unbridgeable space of experience, they both understood. The crew began to realize that this was not simply a meeting between a commander and a soldier. This was an unspoken confrontation. Quiet collision between the cold machinery of command and the raw reality of what it demanded. She had walked into the jaws of death and dragged others back with her, and the system she served had chosen to file it away in silence. That silence now seemed to echo across the deck louder than any shouted order. She stood still, not looking away, not softening her stance. The wind tugged at her fatigues, her hair shifting across her face. But she made no move to fix it. She looked as if she had been carved into place by the moment itself, rooted to the steel of the deck, her boots planted as firmly as if the waves could not move her. She had shown him the wound not to seek approval, but to force him to look at something that could not be, erased with ink or hidden behind closed doors. The sailors in formation felt it too. This was not the kind of moment they had ever been trained for. It was not in the manuals. It was not in the drills. Yet it gripped them as tightly as the heat of battle, because they knew they were seeing something rare, the truth standing exposed in front of power and refusing to bow. They dared not move, dared not speak, because they did not want to break. Whatever fragile thread was holding this moment together, some of them remembered their own scars and the stories that came with them. Stories that never made it past the debriefing table. Stories that were buried under layers of procedure and paperwork until they might as well have never happened. But here, in the open under the fading light, those hidden truths seemed to stir again in their chests, as if the sight of hers had awakened something they had long kept quiet. The Admiral finally took a step forward, the sound of his boot on the deck sharp, and deliberate, his face still unreadable, but his eyes locked on hers with a focus that was almost unsettling. He stopped close enough that the wind pulled at the edges of his coat, brushing against her arm. But neither of them moved away. The crew could feel the air tighten between them as if the ship itself was bracing for impact. His voice did not come instead. The silence deepened, becoming almost unbearable. She met his gaze without flinching, her posture unbroken, her breathing steady. The light above them now came mostly from the lamps mounted along the deck, their glow cutting through the gathering dark, casting sharp edges of shadow across the steel and across their faces. It made the lines in his expression seem deeper, made her stance seem even more unyielding. In that glow, the crew could see the truth of what was happening. The scar was not just a mark on her body. It was a challenge to the very way things worked. It said without words that there were things worth breaking, orders for that. There were times when survival demanded defiance, and that sometimes those choices were the only reason anyone made it home. The Admiral had to face that truth now, and they could all see the struggle in the way he held himself, so rigid, so controlled. The waves lapped against the hull below, a steady, unchanging rhythm as the wind pushed harder through the rigging and the flag snapped above them like a whip. The sound was sharp in the quiet, almost violent against the stillness. The crew felt that sound in their bones. It seemed to underline the tension between the two figures standing at the center of the deck, as if the world around them was demanding an answer that neither was ready to give. She finally let her shirt drop fully into place, but her eyes never left his. She had made her point without speaking, had left the image of that scar in his mind and in the minds of every sailor watching. There was no taking it back now, no undoing the truth that had been laid bare. The question was whether he would acknowledge it or let the silence remain. The darkness was settling fast, the first stars faint in the sky above the deck lights flickering brighter in response. The Admiral stood unmoving, his shadow cast long across the steel, his boots planted firmly, as though if he shifted even slightly, something would break. He looked at her as if trying to decide whether to speak or to let her walk away and leave the weight of the moment behind. The crew waited, barely breathing as the seconds stretched, each one feeling longer than the last. They knew something was going to happen. They just did not know if it would be the kind of thing that would echo through the ship for years, or vanish into the unspoken. History of the sea. The Admiral stood frozen, the weight of her words pressing into the silence like a stone in deep water. The air in the room seemed to thicken, each breath harder to draw, and every man and woman present felt the pull of her presence the wound had, spoken louder than any argument, any plea. And now her voice was a blade cutting through the stillness. She told them of the ambush in the narrow streets of a coastal city, the smoke thick and black choking the air, the sound of boots pounding on, broken pavement as the enemy closed in. She described the heat of the blast that tore through the convoy, flipping metal and flesh alike into the air. She could still see the twisted wreckage and the faces of her comrades, some gone in an instant, others crying out for help. Their voices fading into the chaos. She had crawled from that wreckage, blood pouring from her side, the taste of ash and iron in her mouth. But she did not stop. She dragged 2 wounded Marines across the debris through the shattered glass, ignoring the searing pain that gnawed at her ribs. She found cover and returned fire until reinforcements arrived. The room could almost hear the echo of gunfire and the ringing in her ears. She spoke of the days after the medics, telling her she would never return to active duty, and the way she had refused to let that define her. Her wound was not just a mark on her body, it was a testament to what she had given and what she was willing to give again. But now she stood in a place where the battles were not fought with rifles, but with orders and policies. She accused them of forgetting the faces of the men and women who carried the weight of those orders. She said she had been summoned here because her testimony could sway the course of an operation, one that would put soldiers in the same streets where she had bled and watched her friends die. She warned them that the intelligence they were relying on was flawed, that their plan would lead to another slaughter. Admiral clenched his jaw but said nothing, his eyes fixed on the scar as if it could answer the questions in his mind. She could see his hesitation and pressed on, telling him of the whispers she had heard from the ground forces about enemy movements. That did not match the official reports. She told him about the contacts she still had in the city, men and women who had risked their lives to get her messages out, and the fear in their voices when they said the enemy was waiting in greater numbers than anyone here believed. She painted the picture with ruthless clarity. The dead piled in streets, the blood mixing with the dust, until it was mud. The kind of mud that clung to your boots and never washed away. The Admiral's silence became heavier, each second stretching the tension like a wire ready to snap. His officers shifted uncomfortably, some staring at the floor, others watching him closely, waiting for a sign of what he would do. She took a step closer, closing the gap until she was within arm's reach, her voice low but unshaking. She told him this was his chance to stop a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She had seen leaders send men into death without lifting a finger to stop it. She dared him not to be one of them. In that moment, the room seemed to tilt, the Admiral's authority balanced against the raw truth in her eyes and the proof carved into her flesh. He could order her out, dismiss her warnings and proceed, or he could act on what she had risked everything to tell him. The air was thick with unspoken questions, and the quiet hum of the lights above seemed deafening. She stood there unblinking, knowing she had given him everything he needed to decide, yet unsure if it would be enough. And in the depths of his stillness, she thought she saw a shadow of conflict, a man caught between duty and conscience. And for the first time since she entered, she believed she might have reached him. The Admiral finally drew in a slow breath, his chest rising as if he had been holding the weight of the ocean inside him. His eyes swept the room, catching the glances of the officers who waited for him to speak, but he still said nothing instead. He turned his gaze back to her, and there was something different there. A flicker of respect, maybe, or a reluctant acknowledgement of the truth she had thrown in his face. He walked toward the wide table at the center of the war room, the maps and reports spread across it like the battlefield itself. He studied them in silence, running his hand along the edges of the marked positions as if trying to feel the pulse of the coming operation. She stayed where she was not moving, not speaking because she knew this was the moment where the balance would tip one way or the other. Then his voice came low but cutting, telling the room to clear. Except for her, the sound of boots on the polished floor echoed as the officers filed out, their eyes darting. Between the two of them, some curious, some uneasy, the door shut with a solid thud, and the quiet that followed felt like a seal on whatever was about to be said. He told her he remembered her file, the reports of the ambush, the commendations, and the wounds. He had read them all, but reading was not the same as standing in front of the person who had lived it. He admitted that her warning had shaken the foundation of the plan, but he needed proof that could stand in the face of those above, him, those who would not be swayed by scars alone. She told him proof existed, but it would not come from tidy reports or intercepted communications. It would come from the ground, from people who saw the enemy gathering in the shadows, she explained. She had a way to get that proof, but it would mean moving fast, and it would mean breaking the chain of command. The Admiral stared at her for a long moment as if weighing the cost, then finally asked what she needed. She told him she needed a small team loyal to the mission, not to politics and clearance, to move without interference for 72 hours. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing as though he could see the political firestorm that would follow, but then he surprised her by asking if she was still capable of leading such a team. She answered without hesitation that she was. He paced the room, his footsteps slow, his mind clearly waging war with itself. But then he stopped, turned, and gave her a single nod. She felt the shift in the air, like the moment before a storm breaks. He told her he would authorize the operation, but it would have to be silent. No paper trail, no official record. If she was caught, he would deny knowing about it. She accepted without a blink, because she had walked into worse without permission. He pulled a folded document from the table drawer, signed it, and handed it to her. It was not a formal order, but it was enough to get her through the first layers of military checkpoints with it in her hand. She knew the mission was alive. As she tucked the paper away, he warned her that this was not just about proving her right, it was about keeping people alive, and if she failed, the operation would proceed as planned. She told him failure was not an option. He studied her one last time, and she could see the decision in his eyes hardening into resolve. He dismissed her, and she turned for the door. Her boots echoing in the empty corridor outside, she felt the weight of what she had just taken, pressing against the wound beneath her shirt, a reminder that this was not just about orders and strategy. This was about faces, names, and lives she would not let be erased by flawed intelligence and pride by the time she stepped into the night air outside the base. The plan was already forming in her head. She would need her contacts, the ones who owed her favors and the ones who simply believed in her enough to follow her into the unknown. The clock was ticking, the enemy moving in shadows, and somewhere deep in that coastal city, the truth waited to be dragged into the light. She had 72 hours, and she intended to use every second. The night air carried the salt of the sea and the low hum of distant generators as she moved quickly along the narrow back streets, the dim lights from scattered windows casting fractured shadows across her path. She pulled her hood tighter over, her head blending into the city's restless flow of workers, fishermen and night traders. The mission was already a living thing in her mind. Each step a calculated move. Each glance a search for signs of trouble. She knew where to find the first man. She needed a former intelligence runner who now made his living trading information to the highest bidder. But in the past, when things turned deadly, he had chosen loyalty over profit and saved her life. She found him in a dimly lit cafe, hidden between two decaying warehouses. His eyes widened when he saw her, but not from surprise. More from the weight of knowing what her sudden appearance meant. He did not ask for small talk, just leaned back in his chair and told her he had heard whispers, of movement in the east docks, men arriving without paperwork, ships unloading at hours when no officials were watching. He said the whispers came with tension, the kind that meant something was about to break. She told him she needed more than whispers. She needed faces, names, and the location of any hidden staging areas. His answer came after a long pause. He could get her what she wanted, but it would draw attention, and the people she was after were not amateurs. She promised him it would be worth the risk. And for a moment he studied her as if measuring whether she still carried the same fire she had years ago. Whatever he saw convinced him because he stood, slid an envelope across the table, and told her it contained a location and a contact who could take her inside the network if she had the courage to walk in. She did not hesitate. She took the envelope, paid the bill, and slipped back into the streets, the sound of boots on cobblestones echoing faintly behind her, as if the city itself was keeping watch. The location led her to the far end of the industrial docks where rusted cranes loomed over dark water and the smell of oil clung to the air. She found the contact leaning against a stack of cargo containers, a lean man with eyes that darted like a predator's, scanning for threats before settling on her. He asked no questions, just jerked his head toward the shadows and told her to follow. They moved silently, weaving between crates and stacks of tarped goods until the faint glow of a fire came into view ahead. Gathered around it were 6 men, their weapons resting casually at their sides, but their posture tense. The contact whispered that this was one of the entry points where shipments were moved unseen. She stepped forward into the firelight, every muscle ready to react. The men looked up, their eyes narrowing as they sized her up. One spoke in a low voice, asking what business she had here. She told them plainly that she was here to stop something from happening, something that would leave this city in ruins, and that she needed proof. They shifted uneasily, exchanging glances because they had heard the same rumors, though none had seen the full picture. She told them she had 72 hours to expose the truth. And if they helped her, they would not just be saving the city. They would be saving themselves. One of them finally stepped forward, his voice carrying a mix of doubt and curiosity. He said there was a warehouse further inland guarded, but never listed in port records, and that every time a shipment left there, men in unmarked vehicles followed. She asked him how to get inside, and he told her bluntly that walking in was suicide, but if she could handle the dark, there were tunnels under the docks used decades ago for smuggling. She felt the rush of adrenaline because she knew tunnels meant access without visibility. She asked for a map, or at least directions, and he nodded toward the contact, who produced a rough sketch on a piece of scrap cardboard. With the sketch in hand, she turned to leave, but one of the men called after her, saying if she went down there, she would be walking into more than just enemy territory. She would be walking into a place where people vanished without a trace. She told him she had been to worse places and walked out alive. The contact led her back through the maze of containers to the outer edge of the docks, where the streetlights were few and the shadows deep. She paused there, letting the silence settle around her, the sound of the waves lapping against the pilings like a slow heartbeat. She knew the tunnels would not just hold the proof she needed, they would hold whatever the enemy had been hiding from daylight. And the thought that somewhere, beneath her feet, the truth waited, made her grip tighten on the handle of her weapon. The clock in her head kept ticking 72 hours less, the time she had already spent every second bringing her closer to the point of no return. She pulled the hood tighter over her head and started walking toward the mouth of the path that would lead her underground into the dark where the real game would begin. The entrance to the tunnels was nothing more than a rusted hatch, half buried under decades of debris, hidden behind a row of abandoned storage sheds. The air around it was thick with the smell of damp stone and old oil. She crouched down, brushed away the dirt, and forced the hatch open. The metal groaned in protest, sending a low echo into the darkness below. A narrow ladder led down into blackness, and without hesitation she swung onto it, her boots hitting the ground with a muted thud. The tunnel stretched ahead like the throat of some sleeping beast. The walls slick with condensation, the faint sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance. She flicked on her small flashlight, keeping the beam low to avoid drawing attention every step. She took stirred dust and memories of men who had once used these passages to move contraband unseen. Her breathing slowed as her ears strained for any sound beyond her own. The deeper she went, the more the city above faded into silence, replaced by the slow hum of underground machinery somewhere far ahead. She reached a fork in the tunnel. The left path collapsed decades ago, the right showing fresh footprints pressed into the thin layer of grime. She crouched to study them. They were recent. Too recent for comfort, and heavy enough to suggest the men ahead were armed and carrying weight. She followed them, her steps steady but her grip on her weapon tightening. With each turn, the air grew warmer, carrying faint traces of diesel and something acrid that stung her nose. The tunnel soon widened into a low chamber where flickering lights cast jagged shadows across crates and barrels stacked high. She slipped behind a column of concrete listening voices carried from somewhere deeper in the chamber, low and urgent, speaking in a language she could not fully understand, but their tone was enough to convey caution and readiness. She edged forward, keeping herself within the cover of shadows until she could see them, 3 men in dark clothing. Moving around a table covered in maps and small metallic devices, one of them tapped a location repeatedly on the map, and another nodded before tucking something into his jacket. Her instincts told her they were preparing for movement soon. The urge to strike now battled with the need for information. She chose the latter, shifting silently until her line of sight caught the map clearly. The markings were centered on the inland warehouse the dock worker had told her about, but there were also lines drawn to several points around the city. The pattern suggested multiple strikes at once. She snapped a mental picture of the layout, knowing it could be the leverage she needed before she could retreat. One of the men turned sharply, his gaze scanning the shadows, his hand brushing the grip of his weapon. She froze, her breathing shallow, the beam from his flashlight slicing through the dark and landing just a few feet from her position. A distant clang of metal from another tunnel pulled his attention away, and he muttered something before they gathered their things and moved toward a steel door on the far side. She waited until their footsteps faded, then crossed the chamber to the table. The map still there, but stripped of smaller items. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her jacket before heading toward the opposite tunnel. The passage ahead grew narrower, forcing her to move sideways at points, the ceiling lowering until she could almost feel the weight of the earth. Above her, she could hear faint machinery now, a steady, rhythmic thump that spoke of heavy equipment at work. She emerged into a cavernous space where massive generators lined one wall, their engines rumbling. The heat, oppressive pipes snaked along, the ceiling dripping condensation into dark pools on the ground. 2 guards stood at the far end, watching over a reinforced door. She studied their posture, their gear, their weapons, all professional, all alert. She scanned the area for alternatives, and found a maintenance shaft partially hidden behind one of the generators, crouching low. She slipped toward it, every movement calculated, every sound muted. The shaft was narrow and angled upward, the metal rungs slick with moisture. She climbed, slowly emerging into a lofted space above the guarded door. From here, she could see into the room beyond. What she saw tightened her chest, rows of crates unmarked but unmistakable in their shape and size, weapons, explosives, and equipment enough to arm. A small battalion men moved in precise rhythm, loading gear into black containers, each marked only with a red triangle on the side. It was a staging point, a hidden heart feeding the operations across the city. She scanned for any sign of a leader, and spotted him, a tall man, with a cold efficiency in his movements, directing the others with minimal words. His presence radiated authority and danger. She memorized every detail about him, his face, the way he stood, the faint scar along his jaw. Then she began to retreat, knowing this was not the place to strike. Not yet. She needed to get the proof out, get it to someone who could act before the clock ran out. The climb back down the shaft felt longer than before, her mind racing with what she had seen. Once she was back in the narrow tunnels, she quickened her pace, retracing her steps to the hatch above, the sound of the city seeping back into her senses. When she emerged into the night, the air felt sharper, colder, as if the city itself knew what she had just discovered. She closed the hatch, replaced the debris, and walked quickly into the shadows. The map pressing against her chest like a heartbeat, she had the proof she needed. But now the real danger would begin, because the men below would know someone had been in their den, and they would come hunting. The sun had dipped low, casting a molten orange light across the deck as the ship gently rocked in the quiet harbor. The sailors moved like shadows against the fading glow, yet in the officers' quarters the air was far from calm. The Admiral stood by the wide window, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind replaying the scene over and over. The moment she had revealed the wound, the way the entire room had frozen. The scar was not just an injury, it was a map, a signature of battles fought. In places where no official record existed, he could still see her eyes unflinching as she bared that truth. He had read many faces in his career, but hers told him something no report or file could capture. It told him she had crossed a line. Others feared to approach and somehow returned. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ventilation. He turned slowly, facing the long table where the senior officers sat, their expressions uncertain, some shifting uncomfortably as if the weight of what they had seen pressed too heavily on their thoughts. She sat at the far end, her posture still steady, her hands folded on the table, the wound hidden again, but not erased from their minds. One of the younger commanders finally spoke, asking what had really happened that day. But she only shook her head, her gaze drifting toward the Admiral, as if silently asking whether he was ready to hear the truth aloud. He took a deep breath, then nodded, and the words began to flow. Not with drama or theatrics, but with the calm tone of someone who had carried this burden for too long. She spoke of the mission that was never meant to exist, of the orders given in whispers with no paper trail, of the betrayal that came not from the enemy, but from someone wearing the same uniform. She described the ambush, the gunfire in the narrow pass, the shouts in languages she barely understood, and the moment when a round tore through her side, leaving her on the ground, tasting dust and blood. But she had not been alone. There were others fighting to reach her, and some had not made it. Her voice was steady, but the room seemed to lean closer, drawn in by the gravity of her account. She told them how she refused evacuation, crawling instead toward the ridge where a communications unit was hidden, her only thought to call in the air support that could save the rest. She made it barely conscious and keyed the coordinates before blacking out. When she woke, she was in a makeshift camp, surrounded by unfamiliar faces, some allies, some not. The scar she carried now was stitched in the dim light of a tent far from any medical base. The Admiral listened without interruption, his mind assembling the pieces matching them to rumors he had heard, but never believed. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that she had been used, abandoned, and left to vanish quietly. But instead she had come back, carrying proof in her body and in her memory. He realized that her presence in this room was not just about telling her story. It was a challenge, a demand that the truth be faced no matter how many careers it might destroy. When she finished, the silence held for a long moment. No one seemed to breathe. The Admiral finally moved, stepping forward, until he stood beside her, his voice low, but carrying across the table. He told the others that what they had heard would not leave the room for now, but it would not be buried either. He promised her that this time, the truth would be carried forward, not hidden away like so many other things he had seen in his service. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something other than steel, perhaps relief, or perhaps just the recognition that someone else now bore a piece of the weight she had carried alone for years. She rose slowly, the officers around the table watching her, as if seeing her. For the first time, she walked out into the cool night air, where the lights of the harbor reflected off the water, each ripple, like a fragment of the life she had fought to keep. The Admiral stayed inside for a while longer, staring at the map spread across the table lines and markings that now meant far more than they had an hour ago. He knew the fight ahead would not be easy, that there would be resistance from those who had everything to lose, but the wound she had shown him was more than a scar. It was a battle standard, a sign that some truths could not be erased, and he was ready to follow where it led outside. She stood on the deck, the wind tugging at her hair, the distant sound of waves against the hull. She closed her eyes and for a brief moment let herself feel the peace she had fought so hard to find, knowing it might not last, but also knowing that this time she would not face the storm alone.